The number didn't sound real at first. It didn't feel like something that belonged in women's basketball, or even in professional sports conversations tied to the WNBA. It felt inflated, misreported, almost exaggerated. The kind of figure that usually gets corrected within hours. But this one didn't disappear. It didn't get walked back. It only grew heavier the more people looked at it. $28 million. Not over a lifetime. Not spread across a dozen unrelated ventures. But tied directly to one player, one endorsement deal, one moment in time. A contract so large that it didn't just rewrite expectations. It shattered the framework the league had been operating under for decades. And the most uncomfortable part wasn't that the money existed. It was that the money didn't come from the league. While the WNBA was still presenting itself as a carefully balanced ecosystem, built on parity, collective growth, and shared sacrifice, something else was happening quietly in the background. A parallel economy was forming. One that didn't need league approval, didn't rely on salary caps, and didn't answer to traditional power structures. And at the center of it was Caitlin Clark. Publicly, everything looked fine. Smiles at press events. Brand launches. Rehab updates. Carefully chosen words about patience and growth. From the outside, it appeared like the league had finally found its next generational star and everything was moving forward exactly as planned. But behind closed doors, the tone was very different. Because this wasn't just a big endorsement. It was a signal. A declaration that the most valuable asset in women's basketball was no longer financially dependent on the league she played for. And once that reality set in, the balance of power quietly flipped. For years, the WNBA's leverage was built on a simple truth. If you wanted visibility, legitimacy, and a professional platform, the league was the gatekeeper. Salaries were limited, yes, but the exposure was priceless. That trade-off held the system together. Players accepted below-market pay because there was no alternative strong enough to replace the league's role. That assumption no longer holds. In a single stroke, the endorsement numbers exposed a gap so wide it became impossible to defend. While the league paid its most talked-about rookie a base salary that barely crossed six figures, outside partners were paying her at a level that most franchises could never touch. For every dollar the league put on paper, corporate sponsors were offering hundreds more. That kind of imbalance doesn't just raise eyebrows. It raises questions the league cannot answer. How do you assert authority over a player who doesn't need your paycheck? How do you enforce discipline when the league's salary is symbolic compared to what comes from elsewhere? How do you protect your brand when another company has invested more in a single athlete than the league can afford to invest in its entire roster? Those questions landed squarely on the desk of Kathy Engelbert, and insiders suggest they did not land gently. Because this wasn't happening at a convenient time. The league was in the middle of crucial negotiations, media discussions, and long-term planning designed to present stability and growth. Instead, the narrative shifted overnight. Every headline, every segment, every social post kept circling back to the same uncomfortable comparison. Endorsement money versus league salary. And once that comparison entered the mainstream, it couldn't be undone. This wasn't just about one player getting paid. It was about the league losing its position as the financial center of gravity. The WNBA had spent years trying to convince the world that it was a premier professional destination. Then reality stepped in and quietly suggested something else, that for its biggest star, the league might be the smallest piece of the puzzle. That realization didn't just frustrate leadership. It threatened the foundation of how the league operates. Because when the player becomes bigger than the shield stops protecting power. It becomes decoration. And the most dangerous part. This wasn't a loud rebellion. There was no public confrontation. No dramatic statements. No ultimatums. The shift happened silently, through contracts, numbers, and market behavior. By the time anyone reacted, the leverage was already gone. This is the moment everything changed. Not when the deal was announced. Not when the shoe was revealed. But when the league realized it was no longer the one signing the biggest checks in its own sport. That realization set off a chain reaction that touched the commissioner's office, locker rooms, officiating decisions, media narratives, and even the future structure of women's basketball itself. And this was only the beginning. For decades, the WNBA's authority rested on a quiet but powerful assumption. No matter how talented a player became, the league was still the center of her professional universe. It controlled scheduling. It controlled visibility. It controlled legitimacy. Endorsements existed, but they were secondary, supplemental, nice to have, not something that could fundamentally alter the balance of power. That assumption collapsed the moment the financial math stopped making sense. In 2025, Caitlin Clark reportedly earned close to $20 million from endorsements alone, while the league she played for paid her a base salary hovering just above $100,000. Even accounting for bonuses, it wasn't a rounding error. It was a chasm, a gap so extreme that it rewrote the meaning of professional compensation inside women's basketball. This wasn't a case of a star being slightly underpaid relative to her fame. That happens in every sport. This was something else entirely. For every dollar the league paid her, outside partners paid nearly $200. No professional league, men's or women's, had ever operated under that kind of imbalance without consequences. And consequences came quickly. The moment a player earns exponentially more from third parties than from her employer, the employer loses its most effective tools. Fines stop mattering. Suspensions lose their bite. Mandates feel symbolic. Authority becomes performative rather than practical. The league can still issue rules, but enforcement becomes complicated when the punishment no longer carries financial weight. That's the leverage problem. In traditional league economics, the paycheck is the anchor. It's the mechanism that aligns incentives. Miss games, lose money. Violate policy, lose income. Fall out of favor, feel it immediately. But when league salary becomes a footnote compared to endorsement income, that entire system breaks down. And it didn't just break for Clark. It broke visibly. Every discussion about discipline, scheduling, load management, or media obligations now had an unspoken asterisk attached to it. The league needed her presence far more than she needed the league's paycheck. That imbalance flipped the negotiating table without anyone formally acknowledging it. This is where WNBA found itself in unfamiliar territory. For years, league leadership had emphasized collective growth. No individual bigger than the product. No single player above the system. It was a philosophy rooted in necessity. Without massive TV deals or billionaire owners willing to absorb losses indefinitely, the league had to operate as a unified front. Star power was celebrated, but never allowed to dominate the narrative completely. Clark's endorsement numbers made that approach obsolete overnight. Because markets don't care about philosophical balance. They respond to demand. And the demand around Clark was measurable, undeniable, and impossible to contain. Television ratings spiked when she played. Ticket prices surged on the road. Merchandise sales followed her name, not the league logo. Even during injury stretches, her visibility didn't fade. Her ads kept running. Her shoes kept selling. Her relevance didn't depend on box scores. That reality exposed a hard truth the league wasn't ready to confront. The economic engine had shifted from the institution to the individual. From the league's perspective, this created a crisis of control. You can't threaten what you can't financially affect. You can't compel compliance from someone whose income streams exist entirely outside your reach. And you can't pretend parity when one player's market value dwarfs the operational budget of entire teams. Behind the scenes, this forced uncomfortable internal conversations. Not about whether Clark deserved the money. Most people acknowledged she did, but about what her financial independence meant for the league's authority. How do you sell a collective bargaining agreement when the most visible face of the sport already lives outside its constraints? How do you negotiate media rights when broadcasters know exactly which games drive viewership? The numbers don't lie, and in this case, they talked loudly. When the league paid Clark a fraction of what her market generated elsewhere, it unintentionally admitted something it had spent decades trying to avoid saying out loud. The WNBA was no longer the primary financial driver of women's basketball stardom. It was a platform, not the destination. That distinction matters. Platforms can be replaced. Destinations cannot. Once that realization settled in, everything else began to feel unstable. The league still controlled the schedule, the officiating, and the rules. But the gravitational pull, the thing that makes stars orbit an organization rather than drift away, had weakened. And when leverage disappears, authority doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes quietly, through small concessions, careful language, and strategic silence. The league didn't lose control in a dramatic confrontation. It lost it in spreadsheets, endorsement announcements, and television ratings reports. By the time anyone said it out loud, the power shift was already complete. And that loss of leverage didn't stay confined to the front office. It spilled outward, into places the league could least afford to destabilize, starting with the commissioner herself. From the outside, the commissioner's job looks straightforward. Smile for cameras. Talk about growth. Emphasize momentum. Present stability, even when the ground underneath is shifting. But inside the league office, the reality is far more brutal. And in this moment, Kathy Engelbert is facing a problem no WNBA commissioner has ever had to manage. She isn't dealing with a rebellious player. She isn't dealing with a contract dispute. She's dealing with irrelevance, of the very power her office is supposed to represent. Engelbert came into the role as a business-first leader, a former CEO, a numbers person, someone brought in specifically to professionalize the league's image and convince corporate America that the WNBA was not a passion project, but a serious investment opportunity. Her mandate was clear: grow revenue, stabilize operations, and protect the league's brand. The Nike deal undercut all three. Every time a major outlet mentioned Caitlin Clark, they mentioned the money. And every time they mentioned the money, they mentioned the contrast. 20+ million from sponsors versus barely over 100,000 from the league. That pairing became unavoidable. It turned into shorthand for everything the WNBA didn't want highlighted. Instead of stories about expansion, community impact, or competitive balance, headlines kept circling back to one uncomfortable question. How could the league that employs the biggest star in women's basketball pay her so little? That question doesn't just embarrass leadership. It undermines credibility. From Engelbert's perspective, this wasn't just bad optics, it was a branding disaster. The league had spent years trying to move away from the narrative of financial fragility. They wanted to be seen as sustainable, modern, and worthy of long-term investment. The endorsement disparity dragged the conversation backward, right into the territory they had fought to escape. And it did so publicly. Every investor pitch, every sponsor meeting, every media negotiation now came with an unspoken comparison hovering in the background. If a single player could command more financial commitment from Nike than the league could offer its entire roster, what did that say about the league's value proposition? That's where the frustration reportedly turned into anger. Not because Clark was getting paid, Engelbert has never publicly criticized that, but because the deal stripped the commissioner of narrative control. The WNBA could no longer frame success on its own terms. The market had spoken, and it spoke louder than any press release. There's also a personal element here that rarely gets discussed. Commissioners derive authority from relevance. Their power isn't just administrative. It's symbolic. They represent the league's ability to set standards, enforce rules, and shape the future. When a player's endorsement portfolio becomes more influential than league policy, that symbolic authority erodes. Engelbert wasn't losing a debate. She was losing the room. Every time Clark's Nike campaign rolled out without reference to the WNBA schedule, it reinforced the idea that the league was optional. Every time Clark's income climbed during injury absences, it confirmed something even more dangerous, that the league needed her presence far more than she needed the league's platform. From a business standpoint, that's catastrophic. Because it means the commissioner can't credibly threaten consequences. You can't fine away millions you don't control. You can't scare a player with suspensions when her financial engine operates independently of game checks. And you can't assert authority when everyone in the room knows who actually holds the leverage. The worst part for the league office wasn't the money itself. It was what the money proved. It proved that the WNBA was no longer the top of the economic food chain in its own ecosystem. That realization hit at the exact moment the league was trying to negotiate media rights, expand teams, and position itself as indispensable. Instead, the numbers told a different story. They suggested that for its most valuable asset, The league was a means, not an end. A stage, not the engine. And that's a terrifying position for a commissioner whose job depends on convincing partners that the league is the engine. Insiders suggest this tension has shaped internal decision-making ever since. Publicly calm, privately defensive. Every move scrutinized through the lens of whether it restores control or exposes weakness. And in that environment, even neutral events start to feel threatening. Because once authority is questioned, everything feels like a challenge. And unfortunately for the league, the fallout didn't stay confined to boardrooms and press conferences. The frustration at the top filtered downward, into places where it would do far more damage. Into locker rooms already struggling to process the arrival of a star whose financial reality existed in a completely different universe. That's where the problem stopped being theoretical and started becoming personal. The WNBA has always sold itself on a certain internal mythology. A league built on resilience, on shared sacrifice, on players who endured long flights, overseas seasons, and thin margins not because it was easy, but because they believed in what they were building. That culture mattered. It was how veterans justified the grind and how younger players were taught to wait their turn. Then a rookie walked in carrying a $28 million endorsement deal and a signature shoe. And suddenly, that mythology cracked. Inside locker rooms, nobody said it out loud at first. Publicly, the messaging stayed polished. Supportive quotes, professional answers, statements about growth and opportunity. But privately, the emotional math didn't add up for a lot of players who had spent a decade doing everything the league asked of them. They played through injuries. They spent winters overseas for extra income. They accepted low pay in exchange for stability and visibility. And now, before one full professional season had passed, Caitlin Clark had secured a deal that many veterans couldn't touch in an entire career. That's where resentment starts, not from jealousy alone, but from perceived imbalance. The WNBA has a deeply ingrained, wait your turn, culture. It's not written anywhere, but everyone knows it exists. Respect is accumulated slowly. Status is earned over years. Rookies are expected to blend in, not dominate the spotlight. That system functioned because the rewards at the top were relatively modest. No one jumped the line by that much. Clark didn't just jump it. She skipped the entire staircase. The signature shoe made this impossible to ignore. When news broke that she would receive a Nike signature line before several established superstars, it sent a shockwave through fan circles, and that shockwave spilled straight into locker rooms. Players didn't need to say anything publicly for the tension to be real. Social media filled the gaps. Fans argued on their behalf. Comparisons became unavoidable. When Aya Wilson, widely regarded as the best player in the world at the time, didn't yet have her own signature shoe, the contrast became symbolic. It wasn't just about footwear anymore. It was about recognition, timing, and respect. Wilson eventually addressed it publicly, stating she wasn't jealous. But that response alone revealed how loud the conversation had become. Nobody asks a player to deny jealousy unless the narrative is already burning out of control. From the league's perspective, this was a nightmare scenario. The last thing the WNBA could afford was internal division fueled by money it didn't control. But that's exactly what happened. Clark became the visible beneficiary of a system that veterans felt had never worked in their favor. And here's the uncomfortable truth. None of that resentment was really about Clark as a person. It was about what she represented. She represented new money. She represented outside validation. She represented a future that arrived too late for some and too early for others. In any workplace, that creates friction. In a league built on collective struggle, it creates fault lines. On the court, those fault lines became visible in subtle ways. Physical play that felt personal. Defensive pressure that crossed into hostility. Moments that fans interpreted as welcome to the league toughness, but that, over time, started to feel targeted. Whether intentional or not, perception became reality. And perception matters more than intent. Because once fans start believing a league is hostile toward its biggest draw, the narrative turns fast. What might have once been framed as competitive intensity began to look like resentment playing out in real time. Clips circulated. Commentary escalated. Every hard foul was dissected, slowed down, debated. The locker room divide didn't need to be acknowledged officially to exist. It lived in tone, body language, and silence. And the league office found itself in an impossible position, trying to protect harmony without acknowledging the root cause of the tension. They couldn't criticize veterans without alienating the core of the league. They couldn't protect Clark too visibly without reinforcing accusations of favoritism. They couldn't pretend the money gap didn't exist because everyone already knew the numbers. So nothing was said. And when nothing is said in a moment like this, frustration doesn't disappear. It hardens. The WNBA had successfully navigated generational transitions before, but never one where the incoming star was economically untouchable. This wasn't Magic and Bird rising together. This was one player arriving with a financial safety net so massive that traditional locker room hierarchies stopped making sense. And while leadership tried to keep the peace with carefully worded statements and neutral officiating language, the divide continued to grow quietly. Because resentment doesn't need encouragement. It only needs contrast. And the contrast in this case was impossible to ignore. For nearly 2 decades, one issue symbolized everything players felt the league refused to prioritize: travel. WNBA players flew commercial. Not occasionally. Not in emergencies. Every week. Middle seats. Delays. Overnight connections. Missed practices. Bodies already worn down by compressed schedules were expected to recover while navigating the same travel chaos as regular passengers. For years, players raised concerns about safety, recovery, and performance. And for years, the answer was the same: we can't afford it. That explanation became part of the league's identity. It was framed as realism, fiscal responsibility, proof that the league was being careful, sustainable, and disciplined. Veterans learned to live with it. Rookies inherited it. Everyone accepted it as the cost of playing in a league still building toward the future. Then Caitlin Clark arrived, and the math suddenly changed. Within months of her entry into the league, conversations around security intensified. Arenas were selling out. Road games turned into events. Media presence exploded. With that visibility came new concerns: crowds, attention, unpredictability. Almost overnight, the league announced a sweeping change: a fully funded charter flight program. The price tag was estimated at around $25 million. To the public, it sounded like progress. A long overdue win for player safety and professionalism. And in many ways, it was. Players deserved it. They had earned it. The travel conditions should never have lasted as long as they did. But inside locker rooms, the optics landed differently. Because the timing was impossible to ignore. For 20 years, the league said no. For one rookie season, the answer became yes. That contrast did more damage than the policy itself. To veterans who had spent entire careers boarding commercial flights after night games, the message felt unintentional but loud. When the right star arrives, money appears. When she doesn't, sacrifice is expected. It didn't matter whether that was the league's intent. Perception hardened quickly. The charter decision became symbolic of a broader issue. Not that Clark was receiving special treatment directly, but that her presence exposed how flexible the league's financial boundaries actually were. What had long been framed as impossible was suddenly achievable when the stakes changed. And that realization stung. Because it reframed years of "we can't" as "we won't, until we have to." From the league office's perspective, this was another lose-lose scenario. If they didn't implement charters, they risked player safety issues and public backlash. If they did implement them, they risked confirming exactly what critics were already saying: that the league's priorities shifted only when a singular star changed the economics. Either way, the move reinforced the growing belief that Clark wasn't just a player within the system. She was reshaping the system around her. The commissioner now faced a new kind of resentment. Not overt hostility, but quiet bitterness. The kind that doesn't show up in interviews but lingers in conversations between teammates. The kind that doesn't explode immediately but erodes trust over time. Players weren't angry about flying charter. They were angry about the implication that their safety hadn't been enough reason before. And once again, Clark became the face of a change she didn't personally demand, authorize, or design. But perception doesn't care about process. It cares about timing and contrast. And in this case, both pointed directly at her. The league tried to frame the charter program as a result of growth. Increased revenue, increased attention, increased opportunity, all of which were true. But those explanations didn't fully land with players who had been hearing similar promises for years without results. This was the moment when internal tension crossed from emotional to structural. Because now the divide wasn't just about money or endorsements. It was about lived experience. About who endured the hard years and who arrived when the infrastructure finally caught up. About who paid the cost and who benefited from the payoff. And the commissioner, once again, was caught in the middle. Trying to sell progress while managing resentment, trying to celebrate advancement without acknowledging the imbalance that made it possible. The charter flights were supposed to symbolize a new era. Instead, they became another reminder that the league's transformation wasn't evenly shared. And that unresolved tension didn't fade. It carried over onto the court, into officiating decisions, into public discourse, and eventually into a much darker conversation about protection, physical play, and silence. The tension didn't stay theoretical for long. Once the season got underway, it showed up where everything becomes visible, on the court. Possessions grew more aggressive. Defensive coverage turned relentless. Physical contact escalated from routine to noticeable. At first, it was dismissed as competitiveness. A rookie being tested. A star learning how different the professional game can feel. But over time, the pattern became harder to explain away. Caitlin Clark wasn't just being guarded tightly. She was being blitzed from half court, bumped off routes, face-guarded without relief, and knocked down in ways that drew gasps from new fans who weren't accustomed to the WNBA's physicality. Clips circulated online, slowed down, replayed, and dissected frame by frame. The commentary shifted. This didn't look like, "Welcome to the league" anymore. It looked personal. And the whistle stayed quiet. From the league's standpoint, this created an impossible optics problem. Step in too forcefully, and accusations of favoritism explode. Protect the most visible player, and critics claim the league is bending rules to shield its golden asset. Stay silent, and risk alienating the very audience that tuned in specifically to watch her play. So the league chose restraint. Officials let play continue. Statements emphasized consistency. The message was subtle but clear: everyone is treated the same. No special protections. No superstar calls. Equality over perception. On paper, that sounds fair. In practice, it backfired. Because fairness doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists within context. And the context here was a rookie who had brought millions of new viewers into the sport. Viewers who didn't have years of institutional memory about how physical the league could be. To them, the lack of whistles didn't look like equality. It looked like neglect. What made this worse was timing. This was happening just as Clark's endorsement profile exploded. Just as her visibility crossed over into mainstream sports culture. Just as corporate partners had invested tens of millions into her brand. And yet, on the court, she appeared unprotected. That contradiction didn't sit well with fans. The league's attempt to avoid favoritism created a different narrative altogether, that it was unwilling, or unable, to protect its most valuable draw. Commentators started asking uncomfortable questions. Was the league overcorrecting? Was it trying so hard not to appear biased that it allowed situations to escalate unnecessarily? Those questions didn't stay hypothetical. Every hard foul became evidence. Every no-call became fuel. The online conversation intensified, and with it came a new wave of criticism aimed directly at league leadership. The same office that had greenlit charter flights and celebrated growth now appeared passive in moments that demanded clarity. Behind the scenes, this raised alarms far beyond the WNBA. When a corporation like Nike invests heavily in an athlete, it doesn't do so casually. That investment is protected, carefully monitored. And insiders have suggested that conversations took place, quiet ones, about player safety, officiating consistency, and risk exposure. Because from a corporate standpoint, this wasn't about fairness or optics. It was about asset protection. If the league wouldn't visibly intervene, corporate stakeholders had every incentive to make their concerns known. A player with a multi-year, multi-million-dollar endorsement deal represents long-term value. Letting that value absorb unnecessary physical risk makes no business sense. That pressure squeezed the commissioner from another direction. On one side, players and advocates demanding equality and consistency. On the other, corporate partners expecting reasonable protection for their investment. And in the middle, a league terrified of the social media backlash that would come from being perceived as favoring one player over others. The result was paralysis. Games continued. Physicality intensified. Fans grew louder. The narrative hardened. What started as restraint became interpreted as indifference. What was meant to signal fairness began to look like avoidance. And here's the part the league couldn't control. Public sympathy shifted. New fans didn't side with institutional tradition. They sided with what they could see. A star being knocked around without visible recourse. A league hesitant to step in. A commissioner offering neutral language while the controversy grew louder by the day. The silence became the story. Because silence, in moments like this, is never neutral. It communicates priorities. And whether intentional or not, the message many took away was that maintaining appearances mattered more than protecting the product drawing the audience. That realization damaged trust, not just in officiating, but in leadership. And it set the stage for the next crisis, one that had nothing to do with whistles or physical play, and everything to do with words spoken when clarity was needed most. By late 2024, the league wasn't just dealing with physical play controversies anymore. It was dealing with narrative fatigue. Every conversation seemed to spiral into the same place: Clark, favoritism, resentment, race, money, and control. The atmosphere was already tense when the commissioner was asked what should have been a straightforward question about fan behavior and growing hostility online. That was the moment everything slipped. When Kathy Engelbert compared the increasingly toxic fan discourse to the Bird-Magic rivalry of the 1980s, she likely believed she was offering historical context. Rivalries drive attention. Attention drives growth. It's a familiar sports business argument, and one that has been used successfully before. But this wasn't the 1980s. And this wasn't landing the way she expected. Instead of calming the situation, the comment detonated it. Players didn't hear a lesson about growth. They heard minimization. They heard a league leader reframing harassment and hostility as a marketing opportunity. Within hours, backlash poured in from every direction. Fans criticized the comparison. Media outlets questioned the judgment. And most damaging of all, players spoke up. The Players Association released a sharp statement rejecting the idea that abusive behavior could be justified as rivalry. Prominent veterans publicly distanced themselves from the commissioner's framing. Breanna Stewart and others made it clear that leadership needed to draw firmer lines, not blur them. For the first time in this entire saga, the commissioner wasn't just under pressure from fans or sponsors. She had lost the locker room. That's a critical distinction. Leagues can survive angry fans. They can weather bad headlines. What they struggle to recover from is a credibility gap with their own players. Once that trust fractures, every decision becomes suspect. Every statement is scrutinized. Every silence is interpreted as avoidance. Engelbert's reaction in subsequent interviews told its own story. The tone shifted. The patience thinned. The answers grew tighter, more defensive. Insiders described a leader who felt misunderstood and boxed in, trying to manage growth narratives while navigating cultural landmines she hadn't anticipated. And through all of this, Caitlin Clark said almost nothing. That silence wasn't accidental. Clark didn't wade into the debate. She didn't take sides publicly. She didn't amplify or deflect. She stayed focused on recovery, branding, and basketball. And in doing so, she demonstrated something that unnerved the league even more than criticism ever could. She didn't need to engage. While the commissioner was fighting to control the narrative, Clark's absence from the conversation spoke volumes. It reinforced the idea that she existed above the noise, not because she was protected by the league, but because she didn't rely on it for validation or income. In crisis moments, silence is usually a liability. Here, it was leverage. The contrast was stark. A commissioner trying to explain, contextualize, and reframe. A player doing none of those things and still dominating the conversation. The power dynamic couldn't have been clearer. This incident became a turning point internally. It confirmed fears that leadership was out of sync with both the players and the new audience Clark had brought in. The league wanted to harness controversy without owning its consequences. Players wanted boundaries. Fans wanted accountability. And the commissioner was caught trying to satisfy all three. She failed to satisfy any. What made this moment linger wasn't just the comment itself. It was what it revealed. A disconnect between old-school sports business logic and the modern reality of player-driven ecosystems. Rivalries can sell games, but only when the league is prepared to protect its people and define its values clearly. In this case, hesitation created a vacuum. And that vacuum was filled by speculation, criticism, and doubt about whether the league truly understood the moment it was in. By the end of that week, the damage was done. The commissioner's authority had taken another hit, not because she lost an argument, but because she lost alignment, with players, with fans, and with the cultural climate surrounding the sport. And just when it seemed like the league had reached the limit of its internal challenges, a new threat emerged from outside the system altogether. One that didn't ask for approval and didn't operate under the WNBA's rules. That threat had a name, and it represented the end of the league's monopoly on elite women's basketball. For most of its history, the WNBA operated with an advantage that went largely unquestioned: exclusivity. If you wanted to play elite professional women's basketball in the United States, there was one path, one schedule, one salary structure, one governing body. That reality shaped every negotiation, every contract, and every expectation placed on players. Then that monopoly cracked. When Unrivaled was announced, it didn't sound revolutionary at first. Another off-season league. Another experimental format. Another attempt to add optional income for players. Those kinds of projects had come and gone before without seriously threatening the WNBA's dominance. This one was different. Built by players, not executives, Unrivaled was designed around the very things the WNBA had resisted for years: higher average pay, shorter seasons, and equity participation. Instead of asking players to grind for 5 months for relatively modest salaries, it offered a condensed 8-week season with average compensation reportedly exceeding $220,000. That number mattered, because it wasn't theoretical. It wasn't projected growth. It wasn't future promise. It was immediate, guaranteed income for significantly less wear on players' bodies. When you compared that to the WNBA's average salary, roughly half that amount for a much longer season, the contrast became impossible to defend. From the commissioner's chair, this was a nightmare scenario. A startup league, in its first year, offering better pay per week than an established professional organization that had been operating for decades. That alone raised uncomfortable questions about the sustainability of the existing model. But the deeper issue was leverage. For the first time, top players had a credible alternative. Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier, two of the most respected stars in the league, weren't just endorsing this alternative. They were building it. That distinction mattered. This wasn't an outside investor trying to poach talent. This was players creating infrastructure for themselves. And that sent shockwaves through the league office. Because once players control options, the power balance shifts permanently. No more take-it-or-leave-it offers. No more assumptions that loyalty will override economics. No more pretending that the WNBA is the only stage that matters. For Caitlin Clark, Unrivaled represented something even more destabilizing. Optionality. She didn't need to sign immediately for the threat to exist. The mere presence of the league changed the math. If the WNBA frustrated her, restricted her, or failed to protect her interests, she had alternatives. She could play a short season, earn more per game, and spend the rest of the year focused on endorsements, recovery, and brand expansion. That possibility terrified league leadership. Because Clark wasn't just another star. She was the ratings driver, the attendance spike, the jersey sales leader, the player whose games could swing national viewership numbers by millions. Losing her, even partially, would crater valuations overnight. And Unrivaled didn't need her exclusivity to apply pressure. It only needed to exist. From a negotiation standpoint, this changed everything. The upcoming collective bargaining agreement was already a minefield, but now the league faced talks where its most valuable players didn't need to compromise to survive. They could walk, or rotate, or split time, and the league had no mechanism to stop them without overplaying its hand. The irony is that Unrivaled didn't attack the WNBA directly. It exposed it. It exposed how outdated the salary cap had become. It exposed how fragile the league's control really was. It exposed how dependent growth had been on players accepting less than their market value. And once those truths were visible, they couldn't be hidden again. For decades, the league relied on patience as a strategy, telling players the money would come later. That sustainability required sacrifice now. That loyalty would eventually be rewarded. Unrivaled arrived and asked a simple question: why wait? That question echoed loudly inside front offices. Because now, every frustrated star didn't just have complaints. They had options. And options are the most dangerous thing a monopoly can face. This wasn't about rebellion. It was about choice. And for the first time in its history, the WNBA was no longer the only choice that mattered. This is the reality the WNBA now has to face, whether it wants to or not. For most professional sports leagues, power flows in one direction. The league sets the rules, controls the schedule, negotiates media rights, and distributes revenue. Players can push back, but ultimately they need the league more than the league needs any single individual. That imbalance is what keeps systems stable. That imbalance no longer exists here. The uncomfortable truth is that the league needs Caitlin Clark on the floor far more than Caitlin Clark needs the league's paycheck. Ticket sales prove it. Television ratings prove it. Merchandise numbers prove it. Games featuring her consistently outperform league averages, while games without her drop back toward baseline. That data is not emotional. It's mathematical. And math doesn't negotiate. During the 2025 season, injuries limited Clark's on-court availability to roughly a third of the schedule. In a traditional league economy, that kind of absence would hurt a player financially. Endorsements would cool. Relevance would dip. Momentum would stall. None of that happened. Her endorsement income increased. Her brand visibility remained intact. Her campaigns continued to run nationally. Her name stayed dominant in sports media. In other words, her economic engine operated independently of her presence on the court. That fact alone changes everything. It means the league no longer has the leverage of necessity. Clark doesn't need to play 40 games to sustain her income. She doesn't need to accept unfavorable conditions to stay visible. She doesn't need to wait patiently for the system to catch up. She already exists beyond it. And that terrifies league leadership. Because the next collective bargaining agreement won't be negotiated in a vacuum. Clark's camp can walk into any room with data that shows her direct impact on revenue, ratings, and public interest. They can quantify growth. They can prove dependency. When one side of a negotiation can demonstrate that the other side collapses without them, the tone of that negotiation shifts immediately. This is why the commissioner's frustration isn't about attitude or behavior. It's about powerlessness. The WNBA cannot afford to pay Clark what she's worth on the open market. Not even close. The league's entire financial structure, built around a salary cap designed for a different era, can't accommodate a player whose value now resembles global sports icons. The cap isn't just limiting. It's outdated. The league recently secured a media rights deal valued at roughly $2.2 billion over more than a decade. That sounds massive until you break it down. Spread across teams, operations, travel, marketing, and staff, the slice left for player salaries shrinks quickly. The league simply doesn't have the cash flow to compete with global brands or emerging alternatives. And the players know it. Clark knows it. So what happens when the employee is wealthier than the employer? Chaos, or evolution. The league can try to hold onto old structures, insisting on control it no longer truly has. Or it can adapt, modernize, and accept that star-driven economics are no longer optional. The endorsement era didn't create this problem. It exposed it. The salary cap now looks less like a protective mechanism and more like an artificial ceiling suppressing market reality. And as more players gain leverage through endorsements, alternative leagues, and global opportunities, that pressure will only increase. The real danger for the WNBA isn't that Clark leaves tomorrow. It's that she doesn't need to threaten to leave at all. Her indifference is the leverage. Her silence is the message. Her options are the power. This isn't a rebellion. It's a shift. The league spent decades building something meaningful, and that foundation matters. But foundations alone don't control the future. Markets do. Audiences do. And right now, one player sits at the intersection of both. The question facing the WNBA isn't whether Caitlin Clark is too powerful. It's whether the league can evolve fast enough to exist in a world where she no longer needs it the way players once did. That answer will define the next era of women's basketball. If you're watching this and trying to understand where women's basketball is really headed, not just on the court, but behind the scenes, this channel is built for that exact conversation. We break down the power dynamics, the business decisions, and the stories that don't always make headlines but shape everything you see. If this analysis helped you see the league from a different angle, hit the like button so this video reaches more fans who care about the future of the game. Subscribe to the channel if you want deep, high-level breakdowns like this without the noise or surface-level takes. And leave a comment with your perspective. Do you think the WNBA adapts, or does the gap between stars and the league keep growing? Your engagement directly helps this channel grow, and it tells YouTube this is the kind of basketball conversation worth amplifying.